The wooden chair creaked beneath the immense weight of what had once been England's most vigorous king. Henry VIII, now a grotesque mountain of decaying flesh weighing more than 400 pounds, could no longer stand or walk without help. His legs, once celebrated as the finest in Christendom, had become ulcerated, oozing stumps that dripped with pus and blood. The odor was so overpowering that courtiers covered their faces with perfumed cloths whenever they approached him. This was not merely the decline of a ruler, it was the terrifying conclusion of nearly 4 decades of excess that had turned a radiant prince into something resembling a living corpse. The metamorphosis had begun innocently enough in 1509, when the 18-year-old Henry ascended to the throne. Towering at 6 feet 2, with a lean, athletic build, he embodied the very image of the Renaissance prince, handsome, skilled and vigorous. He could joust all afternoon, dance through the night, and chase deer for hours across the royal parks without tiring. Yet even then, those closest to him noticed something troubling in his relationship with food. Unlike most nobles who dined for pleasure or sustenance, Henry ate with an intensity bordering on violence. The kitchens of Hampton Court Palace were not simple culinary spaces, they were industrial engines of indulgence, operating with the precision of a medieval factory of gluttony. More than 200 cooks, scullions and servants toiled in shifts day and night, their faces reddened and slick with sweat from the heat of 6 gigantic hearths that burned without pause. Each day those fires devoured between 6 and 8 tons of oak. The figures alone tell the story of Henry's monstrous consumption. At the height of his reign, the royal household slaughtered around 8,200 sheep, 2,330 deer, 1,870 pigs, 240 oxen, 760 calves, and 53 wild boars per year. And this was not food for the entire court, much of it was reserved for the king himself. Contemporary observers recorded banquets where Henry would begin with a whole roasted peacock as an appetizer, proceed to an entire swan stuffed with smaller birds, and continue through massive joints of beef that could have sustained a family for a month. Quick reminder, hit subscribe to Rotten Ages for more dark history, and comment below to tell me where you're tuning in from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. What made Henry's appetite especially disturbing was its ritualistic, almost ceremonial nature. Meals were not eaten, they were staged, performed like grand grotesque spectacles of dominance. The king would sit enthroned at the head of an enormous table, surrounded by dozens of platters arranged in geometric perfection. Each course was presented with trumpets and fanfare, as if announcing the arrival of conquering armies rather than dishes of meat. Henry's gaze would sweep across the spread with the cold calculation of a general planning an assault, deciding which dish to conquer first, and which would fall next. The preparation of these meals involved methods so elaborate they bordered on the arcane. The royal chefs invented techniques for nesting animals within animals, crafting monstrous hybrids that defied nature. A single pie might contain a pig stuffed with chickens, the chickens stuffed with larks, all sealed within an enormous pastry shell so dense that specialized blades were required to pierce it. These culinary abominations were less about nourishment, and more about spectacle, symbols of a monarch's will to command nature itself. As the king's appetite grew, so did his paranoia surrounding it. Convinced that his enemies might try to poison him, he ordered a web of security protocols that transformed every meal into a ceremony of dread. Multiple tasters sampled each dish under watchful eyes, their faces scrutinized for signs of pain or death. Food was prepared in locked chambers, transported in sealed containers, and served on plates tested with alchemical powders, said to detect toxins. This fear only deepened Henry's obsession, turning every meal into a high-stakes ritual, where death might hide in every mouthful. His psychological descent mirrored his physical ruin. Courtiers observed how his mood swings seemed tied to his meals. If food was delayed, he erupted in rages that could end in executions. When sated, he became euphoric, boasting, promising, and laughing wildly before sinking again into brooding silence. Food had become his narcotic, his means of escape and self-destruction, and like any addict, he needed ever larger quantities to feel alive. Soon, the king's eating habits began to reshape court life itself. Meals stretched from hours into entire days. Henry would hold audiences, issue decrees, and negotiate treaties, while feasting continuously. Matters of war and diplomacy were discussed through mouthfuls of meat and swigs of wine. Ambassadors wrote home, describing the nauseating sight of a monarch, tearing into food with his bare hands, grease glistening down his arms, as he debated questions of empire. By his 30s, Henry's once perfect body began to rebel. The athletic frame thickened alarmingly, but instead of moderation, the king saw his expanding girth as proof of majesty and strength. He commissioned larger furniture, widened doorways, and demanded stronger horses to bear him. Tailors worked constantly to loosen seams and enlarge his garments, which had grown so vast they resembled tents more than clothing. Then came the illnesses. Henry developed what modern physicians would identify as type 2 diabetes, though to his doctors it appeared as a mysterious curse, a thirst that could never be quenched, and a hunger that only grew. He drank gallons of wine and ale daily, then demanded still more food to silence the craving. His urine grew sweet and aromatic, drawing swarms of flies whenever he appeared outdoors. Sleep became another casualty of excess. His enormous weight made lying flat dangerous, for he would often stop breathing mid-sleep. His doctors constructed elaborate bedding systems, propping him up with mounds of pillows to keep him from suffocating. Worst of all were his legs, once his pride, now the instruments of torture. The constant burden of his weight destroyed circulation, and ulcers opened across his shins and calves, refusing to heal. The infections turned foul and gangrenous, their stench driving attendants to flee. His physicians tried everything known to medicine: poultices, cauterization, bloodletting, even surgery, but the corruption within him spread faster than they could treat. Still, Henry's appetite did not fade. As he entered his 40s, his gluttony reached a level that defied comprehension. It was no longer mere indulgence, it was possession. Those bound by royal oath to serve him watched in horrified fascination as their sovereign quite literally consumed himself to death. They documented his symptoms: uncontrollable cravings, manic outbursts when food was delayed, and an insatiable hunger that seemed to have no physical limit. The royal kitchens had by then become a vision of hell. The heat from the great fires was so fierce that cooks frequently collapsed at their posts, their bodies dragged away and replaced without ceremony. The floors were slick with fat and blood, and the air thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning flesh. Workers suffered chronic lung ailments and burns, victims of an inferno that existed solely to sustain one man's appetite. By dawn, Henry's morning feast would begin, a grotesque parody of holy ritual. He would consume what could have fed a village: a whole roasted fowl, beef joints, several meat pies, and loaves of bread piled high. A few hours later came his second breakfast, followed by an opulent luncheon, afternoon snacks, and then dinner, a monstrous performance that violated all natural restraint. Yet even this relentless consumption brought him no peace. Henry's relationship with food had crossed into pathology. He hoarded dishes in his chambers, hiding meat and bread as though preparing for siege. Servants later found rotting carcasses beneath his bed and inside furniture, evidence of a mind detached from reason. The king's paranoia surrounding food reached a level that bordered on madness. He became convinced that his enemies were not only plotting to poison him, but also to steal from his table. Guards were stationed around the royal kitchens with orders to kill anyone who removed so much as a crumb without permission. Henry would count each platter personally, and if the number did not match his expectations, he erupted into fury. On one occasion he ordered the execution of a servant caught eating scraps from the royal leftovers, declaring that the theft of the king's food was equal to treason itself. Feeding Henry had become an engineering problem as much as a culinary one. As his bulk increased, the logistics of moving and seating him grew more complicated. Carpenters were commissioned to construct special chairs with reinforced frames and hidden wheels so the king could be rolled between chambers. Teams of servants strained to push these contraptions which creaked under the colossal load they carried. These grotesque thrones had become both symbols of majesty and instruments of imprisonment, royal seats that confined a man who could no longer stand on his own legs. By his late 40s, Henry's weight had reached an estimated 400 pounds, placing him among the most corpulent men in recorded history. His once chiseled face had ballooned until his eyes appeared as mere slits buried within swollen flesh. His neck had vanished entirely, leaving the impression of a head fused directly onto his torso. His voice, once commanding and vibrant, had turned into a labored wheeze that struggled to emerge from his constricted throat. The ulcers on his legs, now fist-sized and perpetually open, demanded constant attention from physicians and surgeons. The infections had deepened so badly that some wounds exposed bone. The odor that emanated from his body was so unbearable that courtiers took elaborate precautions to remain upwind or to avoid him entirely. Many sought transfers to distant posts to escape the nauseating atmosphere that surrounded their monarch. Henry's movements were now so restricted that he required mechanical assistance even for the most basic tasks. Ropes, pulleys, and harnesses were installed in his chambers to lift him from bed each morning. Throughout his palaces, ramps replaced stairways and doorways were widened to accommodate his rolling chair. The once mighty king, who had galloped through forests and dominated tournaments, now required teams of attendants to help him relieve himself, dress, and even breathe comfortably. The spectacle of his meals grew ever more disturbing. What had once been social banquets had turned into grotesque performances, attended by courtiers, out of duty or morbid fascination. Henry would devour his food with an almost violent energy, ripping meat apart with his hands, gulping wine as if drowning thirst, his heavy breathing filling the air like an animal's growl. The sounds of chewing, slurping, and panting echoed through the great halls, forming a kind of symphony of gluttony that left guests pale and nauseated. Foreign envoys wrote home in disbelief. The Venetian ambassador claimed the king ate enough for 3 men and drank in proportion. The French envoy described feasts so excessive they bordered on insanity. These reports, preserved in diplomatic archives, form a chilling record of a monarch undone by his own excesses. The royal physicians, bound by oath to safeguard his health, were powerless. They knew the truth that Henry's habits were killing him, but any attempt to interfere met with threats of execution. The king refused even the mildest suggestion of restraint, proclaiming that his appetite was proof of divine vigor. Several doctors resigned their posts or fled the court altogether, unwilling to watch the sovereign consume himself alive. The deterioration of his health strained every corner of royal life, including his marriages. His immense girth made intimacy nearly impossible, and his constant preoccupation with food left no space for affection. Anne of Cleves reportedly fainted when she saw him for the first time, having been promised a handsome prince and instead meeting a swollen ruin of a man. Catherine Howard, the young 5th queen, was said to have cried openly at their wedding feast as she watched her husband devour course after course with mechanical compulsion. The cost of feeding Henry's monstrous appetite had become staggering. The royal kitchens consumed nearly a quarter of England's entire annual revenue. Forests were felled to fuel the palace fires, and the endless demand for meat sent prices soaring across the realm. Farmers were forced to supply livestock as tribute, creating shortages that left the poor malnourished. Chroniclers of the time could not miss the irony. While their king ate himself to death, his subjects starved in silence. As his health worsened, Henry's meals grew even more ritualized. Each day he spent hours dictating elaborate menus, reading them like military campaigns against the animal kingdom. The lists still survive in royal archives: swans, calves, pheasants, peacocks, pies, and puddings arranged in endless succession. His relationship with food had evolved into an act of defiance against mortality itself. His sleep patterns, too, grew erratic. Unable to rest lying flat, he often fell asleep sitting upright in his chair, his head dropping into the remains of his meals. Servants stood helpless as he snored, half choking, sometimes waking with a start only to demand more food. These pitiful episodes became a regular spectacle at court, both tragic and grotesque. By 1546, Henry VIII had become a monstrous parody of his youthful self, a mound of diseased flesh that required an army to sustain. The floors of Hampton Court had to be reinforced so that they wouldn't collapse under his weight. The man who had once danced until sunrise now could barely stay conscious through a single meal. His body was shutting down after years of relentless abuse. The ulcers on his legs had grown so deep that they were said to reveal glimpses of bone. His physicians described them as caverns of corruption, perpetually leaking foul fluids. The stench was so intolerable that servants vomited while changing his bandages. Yet, despite this, the king continued to gorge himself, unmoved by the horror of his condition. What made his decline even more appalling was his total refusal to accept it. Even as his body decayed before everyone's eyes, Henry continued to plan feasts as if preparing for festivals. When his doctors tried to substitute lighter fare, broths, vegetables, smaller portions, he erupted in blind fury. Moderation, he declared, was treason. When his personal physician, Dr. William Butts, dared to suggest restraint, the king had him executed. By this point, Henry's meals defied all sense and proportion. Though barely able to move, he consumed feasts that could have fed entire households. Breakfast alone might include a whole roasted fowl, a slab of beef, multiple meat pies, and tankards of ale. Within hours, he demanded what he called his morning refreshment, another full spread of meats, cheeses, and wines. By evening, he would have eaten enough to satisfy a regiment. The The logistics of feeding him had become grotesque. Special chairs with built-in tables and restraints were constructed to hold him upright during his gluttonous marathons. Servants worked in shifts to supply food continuously, day and night. Records show that deliveries were made to the royal apartments at all hours, suggesting that Henry no longer observed the rhythm of meals. His eating had become a ceaseless process, unbroken by sleep or rest. Yet even more dreadful than the physical decay was the king's mental collapse. His thoughts revolved entirely around food. He would sit for hours, staring at empty plates as though hallucinating the feasts of his imagination. Courtiers reported hearing him describe in vivid detail elaborate banquets that did not exist, then raging when they failed to appear. His world had contracted to one obsession: eating. As his mind deteriorated, so did his fear. Henry became convinced that his enemies were plotting not only to poison him, but to steal his provisions. Guards were stationed in his bedchamber to watch over his food stores through the night. The king would awaken repeatedly to count his supplies, flying into panic if a single dish seemed missing. The atmosphere of the court grew unbearable. Those who had once competed for the privilege of dining with the king now invented excuses to avoid him. The reek of infection, the sight of his trembling hands, the obscene noises of his eating, all created a living nightmare for anyone forced into his presence. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, bore the ordeal in silence. She could only pray as her husband devoured himself to death, knowing any attempt to intervene might cost her life. Records suggest that she spent long hours in her private chapel, not praying for Henry's recovery, but for mercy, for his soul, and for her own. The economic toll of Henry's unrestrained appetite during his final years was nothing short of disastrous. Feeding the king and his court consumed nearly half of the royal treasury. Vast tracts of English countryside were stripped bare of livestock to satisfy his hunger, and the relentless demand for meat left peasants destitute. Entire regions faced famine, as local farmers were forced to surrender animals that would have sustained their families through winter. By early 1547, Henry's body was failing under the accumulated punishment of nearly 40 years of gluttony. Those few physicians who remained in his service kept detailed notes that read like a catalogue of modern diseases. His heart, strained and swollen, struggled to pump blood through layers of fat. His liver, poisoned by decades of ale and wine, had turned yellow and hardened. His breathing had grown shallow and ragged, compressed by the crushing weight of his chest. At times he would doze off mid-meal, his enormous head falling into his plate, only to wake choking on his own food. He had become a prisoner of his own body, unable to stand, barely able to speak, yet still commanding with the imperious will of a king. His attendants, terrified of his wrath, obeyed every command, even those that hastened his death. Servants hauled him upright with ropes each morning, cleaned his infected wounds, and presented him with mountains of food. Physicians dressed his ulcers in layers of linen soaked with wine, honey and herbs, but nothing could stop the gangrene spreading through his limbs. By then the smell had grown unbearable. Witnesses described an odor so foul that it clung to the walls and seeped into clothing. Even the most loyal courtiers kept their distance, covering their faces with scented gloves. Henry's chambers were filled with the constant sound of groans, his own, and those of the servants struggling to maneuver his massive body. Despite his decay, the king's appetite showed no mercy. He continued to eat as if trying to prove that he still ruled over something, if not his kingdom, then at least the table before him. Every meal became a grotesque act of defiance against death. His health collapsed piece by piece. His legs, rotted from the bone outward, left trails of pus on the floors. His skin took on a waxen yellow hue, and his eyes seemed to sink into the folds of his face. Henry's condition soon deteriorated beyond repair. His heart raced unpredictably, his skin turned ashen, and his mind flickered between lucidity and delirium. By January 1547, the inevitable could no longer be postponed. The courtiers who remained were forced to acknowledge that their king, this monstrous shadow of a man who had once ruled Europe's greatest kingdom, was dying. His heart faltered, his breath rattled, and his skin took on the grey tone of the tomb. Even as his body failed, his obsession endured. According to witnesses, his final coherent words were a request for roasted meat. It was as though, in the end, his hunger refused to die before he did. When Henry VIII finally passed, it was not with dignity, but with the grotesque inevitability of nature reclaiming what it was owed. The man who had once seen himself as a god among kings had eaten himself into ruin. The aftermath was as horrifying as his life had been. It took 8 men to lift his coffin, and additional supports had to be added to bear its weight. During the funeral procession, the coffin swelled and burst open from the gases of decomposition, spilling fluids onto the church floor, a sight that left witnesses pale with horror. The court whispered that it was divine judgment, that even in death the king's body rebelled against him. Royal physicians conducted a secret autopsy. Their notes, hidden for years, reveal a body destroyed from within. His heart was twice its normal size, thick with fat, his liver was spotted and hardened from disease. His stomach had expanded far beyond human measure, still holding the remains of his final meal, roasted fowl, beef, bread and wine, all partially digested. His legs were eaten through with infection down to the bone, and pus had flooded his tissues. The verdict was unmistakable. The king had poisoned himself through years of excess. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery of Henry's final meal, still undigested in his stomach. Even in death, his body testified to his last act of gluttony, a meal of roasted birds, beef, bread and wine consumed only hours before he died. It was a grotesque but fitting end for a monarch whose entire life had been defined by excess. The physicians who performed the secret post-mortem reported that Henry's internal organs were beyond recognition. His heart was grossly enlarged, his liver marbled with fat, and his intestines bloated with decay. Infection had ravaged his lower limbs, spreading through the bloodstream until it poisoned every part of him. The sheer size of his stomach defied belief, its lining stretched and ulcerated from years of abuse. There was no mystery left. He had simply eaten himself to death. Painted the portrait of a man who had become a walking monument to his own self-destruction. Henry VIII had transformed from the embodiment of Renaissance vitality into the ultimate cautionary tale of power without restraint. His appetites, whether for food, women, or control, had devoured not only his body, but also his humanity. In the days following his death, the royal court was consumed by a strange mixture of relief and dread. Servants whispered that the palace seemed to breathe again for the first time in years, freed from the constant odor of decay and the terror of his rage. Yet that relief was shadowed by fear. Henry's death left a vacuum, and no one dared speak openly of his condition. His physicians were ordered to silence, and the reports of his illness were sealed in the archives. The image of the great king had to be preserved, even if it bore no resemblance to reality. But rumors spread quickly. Word of the bursting coffin traveled across Europe, carried by ambassadors who had once seen the monstrous figure of the king with their own eyes. To foreign courts, it seemed a fitting metaphor. The body of England's ruler, swollen and rotting, unable even in death to contain its own corruption. In London, sermons cautiously referred to the king's passing as the triumph of the flesh over the soul. Commoners who had once celebrated Henry as their golden prince now spoke of him as a man cursed by God for his greed. Yet among the nobility, a fearful silence prevailed. The chroniclers who later described the event struggled to find words adequate for the contradiction. Here was a king who had once ruled through terror and charisma alike, now reduced to a cautionary spectacle. Some wrote that the gases that burst from his coffin were divine punishment. Others suggested it was nature reclaiming what had been unnaturally prolonged. All agreed that his end seemed to carry a moral message, as if the universe itself had turned against the man who believed he could conquer it. In the aftermath, England found itself haunted by the memory of its fallen monarch. Henry's reign had reshaped religion, law, and power, but what lingered most vividly in the collective imagination was his physical ruin. Painters commissioned after his death carefully avoided depicting his later years. They portrayed him instead as the virile young ruler of legend, broad-shouldered, armored, full of life. The monstrous truth of his final form was buried with him, both literally and symbolically. Yet fragments of truth survived in letters and medical notes hidden deep within the archives. They reveal a man tormented not only by physical disease, but also by a mind consumed by fear and obsession. His paranoia about poisoning, his hoarding of food, his nightly counting of dishes, all symptoms of a psychological decay that mirrored the physical one. The more one studies his decline, the clearer it becomes that Henry's destruction was not sudden but systematic. By the time he died, Henry's kingdom was nearly bankrupt, its people overtaxed, its clergy fractured, yet the palace kitchens still roared with fire, feeding the corpse of a monarchy that could not sustain itself. In many ways, Henry's gluttony symbolized the very empire he had built, vast, powerful, and rotting from within. In many ways, Henry's body became a metaphor for his kingdom. The same excess that swelled his frame swelled his empire, bloated, rich, and unstable. He tore England from Rome, not out of faith, but out of appetite for control. for possession, for the freedom to consume without restraint. His body mirrored the state he created, powerful, magnificent, and quietly dying from within. His death left behind a paradoxical legacy. To some, he remained the mighty Tudor who reshaped England into a modern power. To others, he became a cautionary symbol of vanity, cruelty, and indulgence. Even today, centuries later, the details of Henry's final years evoke a morbid fascination. His case is studied in medical journals as an example of the earliest recorded metabolic collapse, and by historians as a study in the psychology of despotism. He stands as proof that power, when left without limits, does not elevate the human spirit but corrodes it. After his death, the Tudor dynasty continued to rule, but the shadow of his appetite lingered. His daughter Mary inherited his physical frailty and his obsession with divine justification. Elizabeth, though brilliant and disciplined, carried her father's relentless will, his hunger for adoration, and his terror of mortality. The Tudor myth lived on, but so did its curse. Henry's body was entombed in St. George's Chapel at Windsor beside his beloved Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him his only legitimate son. Yet there was a cruel irony in that union. Jane, who had died in childbirth, represented vitality and renewal, while Henry's remains symbolized corruption and decay. Together, they formed a monument to life's two extremes, creation and consumption. He was not conquered by rebellion, by treachery, or by disease brought from abroad. He was conquered by the very thing he worshipped, appetite. His story reminds us that the boundaries between power and ruin, between pleasure and pain, are perilously thin. Those who saw him in his final days could hardly believe he was the same man who had once commanded Europe's respect. The Golden Prince of the early Renaissance had become a grotesque relic of excess, a king who mistook consumption for immortality. His death marked not only the end of a reign, but the death of an illusion that greatness could exist without restraint. Today, his story endures not as a celebration of monarchy, but as a mirror held up to human weakness. His downfall illustrates that no power, no wealth, no divine right can shield the body from decay or the mind from obsession. The flesh, no matter how royal, is mortal. In the end, the throne did not destroy Henry VIII, nor did rebellion, heresy, or betrayal. He was undone by something far more human and far more terrifying: his hunger.